Hi, everybody. Can you guys see and hear me okay? Oh, you guys are amazing. Hi, Linda. How are you? Hi, Chelsea. How are you? Hi, Jermaine. How are you? Rosa, hello. And Akeisha and Mel. Oh, this is great. It's your first live one. That's amazing. I'm so happy to have you here. Hi, Ember and Christy and Ruby and Tony. Good to see you guys. Okay, so let's start as we have been. And I'm going to start by just discussing. Hi, Anna. I'm going to start by, and hi, Tiffany, just discussing some of the questions on the forum that I haven't answered. So tell me how you guys feel about this. I always want to ask for feedback. So I find that there's some really, honestly, in general, everybody asks phenomenal questions. Like, it's such a blessing for me. I'm honestly learning all the time from your guys' questions because you guys ask these really profound questions, and I'm like putting things together in my mind, like, oh, this and this, and I noticed this pattern. And so it's just been an honor, and I'm really grateful for the amazing questions. And I find a lot of them just deserve long answers. So what I've been doing is just addressing some in videos. Like, I think I made like a 40-minute video the other day or something and picked 8 or 9 major questions, either from the Facebook group or the forum. So I went through the Facebook group last night and I answered a bunch of stuff in there, and you guys are so wonderful and so supportive. And I can't say thank you enough to all of you just for creating this community and environment. Like, I think people come in and they just feel so supported, and it's beautiful that everybody's creating this with each other. So I'm going to go through a couple of questions in here, and I'm going to not look at the live stream for a few minutes because it distracts me. I get so excited to hi, Patricia, to sort of jump on here and answer everything and see everything. So I'm just going to go through a few major questions from the forum that deserve some wonderful answers. And then what I don't cover here, I'll go back and type some answers for. So first and foremost, so Free, who's a wonderful part of our community, says, what would be the signs of a DA in healing? What would be normal changes of behavior? What could be early signs? Would it be bouncing back and forth between old and new patterns? So good question. So I'm going to just so you guys know, I'm going to spend about 10, 12 minutes going through these questions, and then we'll dive into the live questions and the topic and some of the bonus content for today about guilt and shame. And if you guys are interested too in like sort of how guilt and shame relates to specific attachment styles, we can do that also. And also what we've done now is we've gone back and put all of the webinars that are specific to each topic in each course. So for example, now if you go to the let's say fearful avoidant course, you'll see fearful avoidance and all the course material, and then the extra webinar material in there with sort of the frequent questions and answers. And as I mentioned, we have this month coming out. So our courses are coming out. The dates that our videographer has given us are the 15th, the 18th, and the 23rd. So those are a rough date. Sometimes they change, but we'll have all of these things out very soon. So codependency and enmeshment, which is I'm so excited for everybody to learn about. Overcoming depression, tragedy, and trauma thought. So just a lot of like sort of moving through depression, and it's sort of from a unique perspective. So it talks a lot about just like sadness in general. Okay. And anyway, so as these courses are coming out, we're going to keep adding the webinars to them and keep picking topics that are specific to them. Okay. So sorry, I sometimes jump around a lot. So Freeze question. What would be the signs? Oh, and then in the new year, we're doing advanced attachment style courses. So just really gathering the next level of all of our attachment style content and just sort of cementing it and putting it together there for you guys. Because that's what the feedback was that I was getting from everybody. So let me know your feedback. I'm listening, and I will keep adapting curriculums and courses and content to meet everybody's needs. So let me know. So Free says, number 1, what would be the signs of dismissive avoidant in healing? Okay, so some of the initial signs you will see. Number 1, they will start being more responsive. So they'll start listening a little bit more and being a little bit more present. Okay. You'll notice some of their irritability go down. They'll still have their irritable moments. And you want to think of this as like a metamorphosis. Like it's not something where they wake up Tuesday morning and they're healed and they're the most secure person. These are like exactly sort of what his Freeze ladder question was here is, would it be bouncing back and forth between old and new patterns? And the answer is yes. Like there's sort of this bouncing back and forth that you'll see. They'll start to become slightly more affectionate, less territorial, need a little bit less space, start spending more time, start communicating more. It might start in small doses, like they might express a little bit here and there. And you might see them express and then kind of pull back, but they won't pull back for as long. You'll notice they might even start coming to resolve fights or communicating a little bit more. And then this will gradually move along until you're at a point where like dismissal avoidance is now secure and they start showing up and initiating communication sometimes or talking about their feelings and needs before they're irritable, right? Sometimes you'll see them set a boundary really hard when they're kind of angry or frustrated, but you'll see them start communicating a little bit more. You'll see them start to initiate vulnerable conversations more often. You will see them start to be more relaxed, talk about their feelings a little bit. That will be one of the last things that you'll sort of see is when they actually start actively expressing their feelings, like, hey, I feel funky, or hey, I feel sad, or I feel a little bit down today, or things like that, where they're just having feeling-based conversations. But mostly you'll see them bounce back faster from a conflict, be open, be more affectionate, and start responding to your needs a lot more if you express them in a gentle and kind way. So those are the big things. And then you'll see like the person can become sort of the secure attachment space. Stacy says, my DA pulls back for a few days. These are great questions. My DA pulls back for a few days after being vulnerable. I think he feels exposed, exactly, and feels a need to protect himself. For DAs, it's about their safety. I try to not take it personally, but I know it's hard to connect emotionally. So absolutely, he feels exposed. This is exactly, they feel like their vulnerability is exposed, and vulnerability when they're children did not feel good, did not feel safe, did not get stored with positive association. So it's like, oh no, I betrayed myself and I was vulnerable. Now, I want to raise a really important point, and this really important point came up in the codependency and enmeshment course. And it's when we're breaking down, let's say we'll use the analogy here of codependency and enmeshment. What takes place is as you're breaking down this barrier, this was an adaptation. Codependency in and of itself, not having boundaries, was an adaptation that you made in childhood, if you find yourself to be this person, to become safe. When you couldn't control anything, it was like, okay, if I violate my own boundaries to get love or approval, at least I'm not getting punished or shamed, or I don't feel the chances of being abandoned, as if they're increasing. So you made an adaptation. So your brain stored this with safety. And so sometimes when we're trying to break down or break through these things, okay, and we're trying to end the codependency and the enmeshment, our brain will make us feel fear and shame, okay? And the idea is, as you're starting to set boundaries, when you first set a boundary or speak up or say something's not appropriate, you're going to feel fear and you're going to feel shame. It's shocking if you don't. And our idea here is for us to be able to feel the fear and shame and do it anyways in incremental doses and support ourselves with compassionate internal dialogue as the process unfolds. And the reason for this is that relationships are only healthy when they are not codependent. Codependent relationships always have elements of toxicity within them. And so when we start breaking down that codependency and we start being able to speak up and express ourselves, it's scary at first, but you'll get used to it and you'll overcome it. And the same thing happens with a DA. They just don't realize that this is what's happening. They are feeling, okay, the fear and shame. They're having the fear and shame, but then they're not thinking that it's good. They're judging the situation by the way that they feel instead of from a higher perspective of looking at the root cause of what's creating the fear and shame and recognizing, hey, even though I feel fear and shame, because when I shut down my vulnerability, that was a protective mechanism in childhood. And that served me at the time. And now my brain's programmed vulnerability to equate to the potential of shame or not surviving or being emotionally rejected or some sort of pain, which the brain is wired to avoid. But even though this is taking place, I have to do this. Being vulnerable is not wrong. Opening up and sharing my feelings, discussing my emotions is not wrong. And I have to be able to see that and break through that limitation instead of getting stuck by the feelings and then using those feelings to navigate what's right or wrong, because our feelings are designed to help us, but sometimes they're not always giving us the exact accurate part of reality. The emotions themselves are always valid, but the interpretations that are creating them may not be. Okay. So, I can't regularly get to the online forum, and so the webinars have come to feel like I'm missing a lot. I can't. Sorry, Chelsea or Tony, what do you mean I can't regularly get to the online forum? So the online forum is always open there. We send an email, and then it's in the members lounge. If you want to, so then we don't get to the topic until very late. Get to the online forum. I'm not sure exactly what you mean. But I appreciate that. I think you're saying you want to start the topic more, but I'm not sure what you mean by the online forum. So if you have any clarification, I'd love to hear it. So what happens, right, as we're talking about this taking place, is that sometimes the emotions themselves are always real neurochemical reactions. Our emotions are always 100% valid experiences. But sometimes these stories or the belief systems that are creating that output of emotion, sometimes those are not always true or accurate. And so we have to go underneath and question the story. So I just want, especially as we talk about shame here, as the topic is guilt and shame, if you're feeling shame in certain situations, you have to ask yourself, what is the content that's creating this shame? What are my beliefs about the situation? Example, DA being vulnerable and then thinking that something's wrong with them and they showed it, or thinking that they're weak for having emotions or whatever. And we have to be able to question those underlying stories, okay? And same thing with codependency. I'm bad if I set a boundary. I'm selfish if I set a boundary. Okay, we have to question those underlying stories, okay? So just important things to note. Here's another one. So this is also from Free. My DA partner can sometimes be really warm and near intimate and vulnerable. He can say some nice, positive, good things in these moments and meet many of my needs and express how this is not a problem to him. Then I don't know what happens. Maybe he ruminates these things for a few days, questioning himself if it was really true or something, or maybe there's just a moment that triggers him and he starts questioning these things he has previously said and expressed. I don't know which it is, but a few days later, he can suddenly act really cold and distant. And in these moments, he can express quite the opposite. Or say he cannot meet the needs he said he could and that weren't a problem to meet. It can be really devastating and exhausting. He can come back and say sorry the next day and say he didn't mean any of it. Okay, so here's what happens. So, and then she goes on to say, I talked to my therapist about it, and she says, and said I feel that he's almost like a child. She asked me if what I mean is that it seems like he is testing me to see if I can stand him, if I can hold him, and if I can be there as he shows me these worst sides. Maybe that is what I feel he is doing. What is your understanding of this? Okay. It's the deactivating strategy. So as a dismissive avoidant is like more towards the spectrum of not being like super dismissive avoidant. What can take place is they can want to meet needs, but then they can feel overwhelmed and trapped by them. And a lot of dismissive avoidants intend well, especially when they're, a mix of other attachment. They're not just purely extreme dismissive avoidance, but then they feel overwhelmed and trapped and helpless and engulfed by the relationship. We can also have people-pleasing dismissive avoidants who are basically dismissive avoidants with a people-pleasing element. And in these cases, they can really fear being engulfed, and then they start to deactivate and push back. And so what needs to take place here for this individual is they need to be able to consciously and intentionally set boundaries that they think are fair for them ahead of time. And whenever we set boundaries, we should be looking at what is requested from me from another person. And this is in the relationship mastery course, by the way. It's like a boundary and needs assessment. It's sit down with your partner or your loved one, friend, family member, whoever it is. Get conscious about these things ahead of time, because whatever we're not conscious about ahead of time appears as an obstacle later. So get conscious, put everything on paper, And those things should consist of what all your expectations and needs are from one another. And then sit down. And when we make a compromise to meet somebody's needs, it should feel like a compromise. It should feel like an extension of ourselves, but it shouldn't feel like a sacrifice, something that's taking away from things that we want, we desire. It shouldn't feel like it's draining us, it's hurting us. There's fear attached or engulfment. And so if we can set these conscious boundaries out ahead of time in these situations, this is when it's going to be healthy. So remember, people can have competing needs. This person could be testing you. Sometimes dismissive avoidants do test at the beginning to see, like, will I be loved as the imperfect version of myself? But they specifically tend to do it very early in a relationship. It's very rare that I see them do it once there's a settling in phase in the relationship. And it's hard to tell free from how your comments are, but it sounds like you've been in a relationship for a decent period of time. And in that case, I wouldn't think as much that it's you being tested. I think it's more like he has competing needs and he's moving towards being more secure and he wants to do these things, but then those fears and triggers pop up. So he has to work through his stories. But again, this is not your job. Your job is to, sort of ask these questions if needed. Hey, do you have any stories? What are the fears about? Have you sort of brought them to the surface and questioned them? And then be able to set a boundary at the same time, or discuss your boundaries ahead of time and make compromises, not sacrifices. And there's always a way. Okay. And the last question that I'm going to go through here is from Ellie. Hi, Ellie. She says, in my relationship with the DA in the past, I remember that he would always get so frustrated when I would assume things, and I never really understood that. If someone assumes something about me and they're wrong, I just correct them. I don't ever recall experiencing someone assuming something about me as a frustration. So I'm just trying to understand that better. Could the frustration be because the DA is not in touch with how they really feel, doesn't have the words to communicate their feelings or correct the assumption? What are your thoughts on that? I've noticed that you are careful to point out when you are making an assumption in the live webinar, so it must be something that really triggers a lot of people. Okay, so great question. So number one, DAs have a core wound and trigger around being misunderstood. So sometimes when people make assumptions, it triggers that feeling for the dismissive avoidant. A lot of them carry that wound. I would say like 90% or more. Like I rarely see exceptions to this. I'm actually not sure if I've ever seen an exception, but it just doesn't tend to be like at the highest rung of the biggest pain points for them, though it is still a pretty big trigger. Also, dismissive avoidants are very literal communicators. So they like to know things directly, bluntly, to the point. So when there's a gray area for things around communication, it tends to also make them feel unsafe. So they're like, oh, don't assume things, have conversations, be direct, get to the point, because otherwise what can go, all these things can go wrong in between. And so it's usually those two pieces I find that can be the strongest. So, interesting. Yeah. So those two things tend to be the reasons they get so triggered. So my advice there is to just be able to ask the question when you have one. Hey, I'm sort of assuming this. Is this true? And just ask. And if it's something that happens unconsciously, just and it does trigger the person. Let's say you accidentally make an assumption, you didn't even realize you made one. Then just make sure that when they do bring it up, you say, oh yeah, I see you, I hear you, I understand that, I recognize I made an assumption. Sometimes I try to fill in the blanks and just explain yourself, but make sure you let the person know that you see and hear and understand them now. And that can be really important. Okay. So the questions are in the Members Lounge on the Personal Development School website, same place where you take the courses. Oh, thank you for explaining that. That's so nice. Okay, so let me just go through some of the questions. So now let's talk. So I hope that answers some of those early questions. Now let's talk about guilt and shame. So I want to put a bit of a highlight here around saying guilt is obviously most associated with the fearful avoidant attachment style. Fearful avoidants tend to struggle with what I would call chronic guilt. And a lot of this chronic guilt comes from codependency at its root level. That's why I'm so excited for these courses to be out there, because it is a massive topic. Hi, Jacqueline. So it's really important to be able to recognize when we're experiencing chronic guilt. A lot of the time it's because we're taking on other people's emotions, and there's different types of boundaries we need to have to avoid both guilt and shame. Okay. And we're going to talk about those different boundaries. And I want everybody to take a moment. And if you have a pen and paper, I know we do a lot of like live Q&A and really going through different topics, and sometimes to do live examples. But today, if you're here live, I would highly recommend that you get a pen and paper and we do some of these sort of exercises together, because it's a really important place to start with overcoming some of the guilt and shame patterns. Okay. So somebody's sick. Who's sick? Mel. Hi, Christy. I hope you're feeling better. You're not feeling great. I hope you feel better. So hi, Akeisha. I'm usually on the Facebook page. Where are all these questions? Oh, I see, Tony. So you are confused about where the questions are. So the questions are in the forum. The questions, if anybody's not seeing them, if you go in the members lounge, you'll see Q&A and you'll see forum. And then you'll see a button that says discuss, and you have to click on it. And then when you'll wait for a second, and then those questions will pop up, and you'll see them in there. And so the ones I don't type, I try to answer in the webinars. And then I'm going to go back and post that, hey, this question was answered on 1210's webinar or something like that. So people have a reference point if they have the same question. Sometimes if you have an old browser, it can be funny. So if you have like an old, like a Windows 7 or an Internet Explorer or something like that, you might have to update your web browser to see them. I noticed that can happen. So check to see if that's part of it if you don't see them. But sometimes you just have to click on that button and wait for a moment. So let's start. I am going to go in some of these questions about guilt and shame, but I'm going to just add sort of some bonus content here. So if you guys can, I would start, I'll actually draw this for you. I hope you guys can see it okay when I draw it. But I would start by writing out 2 columns, okay? Split your page in half. So make like a line halfway through your page, okay? I'm writing in marker so people can see it better. And I would say put guilt on one part, and I would put shame on the other. And then, so you have it now separated into guilt and shame, okay? And what I would then do is I would write down underneath, sort of split it into 2 columns, okay? And one side, I would say boundary, okay? And the other side, I would say story. And then what you want to do is you want to pick, so same thing for the second one, boundary and story. So you want to pick, this is very rough, you want to pick what you find yourself struggling with more. In all honesty, everybody struggles with guilt and shame, just in different intensities and different frequencies and for different reasons. We do tend to see anxiously attached individuals struggle with guilt a lot more. Fearful avoidance struggle with guilt probably the most. And dismissive avoidance struggle with shame the most, though they also go very far out of their way to avoid ever feeling it. So it's like they struggle with it, but they also have these great coping mechanisms to try to never expose themselves to situations where they could feel it, okay? So pick situations in your mind, okay, and try to notice in these different situations in your mind and maybe on the side of your page here, write these 5 things, okay? These are the 5 types of boundaries, and most of us don't even know the different types of boundaries. So it becomes very difficult to know how to set a boundary in real time if we don't even know the types. So the types of boundaries, and you can put this, I have these tiny pages because it's this little book, but maybe on another page or on the same page to the side, these are your 5 major boundaries. Number 1, your emotional boundaries or your feeling boundaries, okay? This is where you take on other people's emotions, or you are good at actually having a boundary between where you start and end and somebody else starts and ends emotionally, okay? So an example of this is, let's say that somebody you know is having a bad day. Let's say it's somebody you live with. And then you feel like, oh my gosh, they're having a bad day. I can't believe this. I have to fix this. I have to save them. Oh, I can't believe they feel this way. And then you get preoccupied in your mind with trying to change the other person's mood or feelings. And if you're preoccupied in your mind, chances are that you don't have very good feeling boundaries in that moment. And it comes back to the principle of compromise versus sacrifice. But I like to give this analogy. let's pretend that I'm sitting with you, all of you, but individually. And let's say that you have a cut on your arm. And then I come up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I see the cut on on your arm. An example of like a feeling boundary violation almost is analogous to this. It's like you have a cut on your arm, and I feel like because you are in pain, I also have to be in pain. And that I'm good if I sympathize this way. And so I slice my own arm, and then I try to come stitch you up or bandage you up while I'm also bleeding. It doesn't, when somebody's already in pain once, it doesn't do any good to have two people in suffering, right? To have two people in emotional pain, preoccupied. It's better that one person's wounded and the other person is present and able and focused and operating in the highest expression of themselves, full access to your neocortex and logical thinking regions in your brain. It's better that one person's fully available to provide true support than two people are emotionally distressed. And here's the essence of codependency when it comes to feeling boundaries. And codependency, guilt, and shame go all very nicely together. That's why I keep bringing it up. But here's the essence of it. You're in pain. I feel your pain, especially you think of parents and kids, right? You're in pain, or my child's in pain, and I feel their pain, and their pain makes me uncomfortable. So now I try to fix their pain as actually a subconscious strategy to get rid of my own pain, my own discomfort. And so what that really connects to is chronic guilt. Because then we're going to be like, oh my gosh, I couldn't fix their pain. We feel way, way, way too badly. We take it so seriously if we ever make a mistake and we hurt somebody, or if we do something that indirectly affects another person. And it's really good to be conscientious about this, but it's not good to be preoccupied, because there's something in psychology called the ironic processing theory. And it's, if I say to you, don't think of the pink elephant, what happens? Everybody thinks of the pink elephant. So what takes place is the more we're like, oh my God, don't make a mistake, don't cause anybody pain, the more we're obsessing over it, the more we're actually programming our subconscious mind with a greater likelihood to cause errors or make mistakes and hurt people indirectly. So chronic guilt it feeds on itself. And then the more guilty we feel, the less happy we are. And the less happy we are, or the more suffering we're in, the less we show up as the highest expression of ourselves, and the more likely we are to hurt people anyways. So there's no positive output here. There's no chronic guilt is great. There's nothing that serves with chronic guilt. So anyways, that's boundary number one, your emotional or your feeling boundaries. Okay. Number two is your thought or intellectual boundaries. Okay. So these will be things like when you want privacy in your thinking, you want to keep things to yourself, or this can be things like maybe somebody violates their own intellectual boundary or thought boundary because they think they have to subordinate their values or opinions to try to be agreeable with somebody else. Okay. So our thought and intellectual boundaries are like our values, our beliefs, opinions, ideals, ideas. Okay. Those sorts of things. Number three, we have material boundaries. Okay. So these will be things like, money, your belongings, your home, your car. Like maybe somebody borrows your car all the time without asking, never puts gas in the tank. Maybe you were always giving money to a family member and they never repay you. Maybe whatever it is, those are going to be your material boundaries. Then we have our time boundaries. Okay. So it's like, how much time am I giving to people? And this can be for a variety of different things. And then we have our physical boundaries and sexual boundaries. You can put those in two separate categories if you want. I tend to put them together, but it's the boundaries around your body. But it can also be things like your physical space, like, wanting people to knock, wanting your kids to knock before they come into your room, or whatever it might be. So notice these are the different types of boundaries. So as you write those in a column, as you write them on the side of your page, go back to your little makeshift drawing here. Okay. And think of times, and this is an exercise to do, not necessarily in the live webinar here, but think of times where you felt guilt, and think of what boundaries you violated when you felt guilty, or what boundaries you were actually violating that made you feel guilty. Does that make sense? So it's like, maybe I made a comment to somebody and I said, hey, let's think of maybe Bob says to Sally, hey, you know what, Sally, you keep asking me for money, but unfortunately, I have to save money right now. I can't, keep giving you money because you don't pay me back. And then maybe Sally's like, oh, and maybe guilt or something like that. Chances are Bob is violating his own material boundaries in advance if he's conditioned Sally to think that he has no needs and he can endlessly give, or if there's been some kind of unequal exchange, or he's violating his emotional boundaries because he's taking on all of Sally's emotions, worrying about her financial state without tuning in and checking in with himself. And so he's on track to violate those things. And then I want you to, in the next space, ask yourself, what's the meaning I gave to this? What's my story around this? And so this might be something like, I'm a bad person if I don't help. I'm a bad person if I don't, fix Sally's problem, and so notice what your expectations are there of yourself. And if you find that in the situation that you're feeling chronically guilty about, some individuals, it's something with a mother, a father, a spouse, a child, whatever it is, you have to notice what your ideal boundary is in order to see that it's been violated in the first place. Most of us do not know in advance what our actual boundaries are. And so it's very difficult to have any context. We just feel the other person's emotions and we just feel guilty. I have a reminder on my phone. I have to make sure that it's turned off. So we don't have this actual space where we've identified our own boundaries ahead of time. So all we notice in real time is when somebody else is in pain and we think, oh my gosh, we should violate ourselves. And this produces guilt chronically. Okay. So if you struggle with chronic guilt, go through that exercise. Notice what your and you can also ask yourself, what are my boundaries in all my areas of life? In an ideal situation, what do people respect? So in my career, what are my boundaries with my colleagues? In my financial area, what are my boundaries with anybody who I might be financially supporting, or I might be, payroll, whatever it is. Get really clear on those things and go through each of the 7 areas of life and check in and ask yourself, am I supporting my boundaries, or am I constantly denying my boundaries and then guilting myself for the times that I don't come through for other people's expectations of me? And if I am the person who walks around conditioning myself to think that to teach everybody that I have no needs, then that's an internal thing that needs to be resolved. Okay. Now, this is just a little bit of bonus content around guilt. Okay. It's a very important thing to do. Now, let's talk about shame. Okay. So in the case of shame, what you'll notice is that usually you are violating your internal boundaries first. Usually you are holding yourself to unnecessary expectations. So you can ask yourself in the same mind frame, okay? Like let's say, for example, that somebody's sick, okay? And I see dismissive avoidance more than anybody else do this. So let's say that somebody's sick, okay? And they are sick and then they need help, and then they won't let people see that they're sick, or they won't tell people, or they'll keep everybody at bay, or things like that, because they're holding this themselves to this internal expectation of going, if I'm sick, people are going to see that something's wrong with me, and that might be their story. Okay. So I don't allow myself to ask for help, to receive help, to do anything. Remember, boundaries can have incoming violations, like people violating your boundaries, overstepping, but you can also have outgoing boundary violations, which can be you violating what would be normal and healthy exchange in relationships. You might show up for somebody else who's sick, but then if you're sick, you won't accept or receive help. So you're actually violating your own boundary in an oppositional way. Oppositional is not the right word. And like to yourself, but the opposite of an incoming boundary violation. Okay. So notice and see what shows up there and see what's going on in those cases. But the vast majority of individuals who are struggling with chronic guilt and shame are also codependent. And I think that's very important to note. So I'm going to go through and answer some questions, and I'm going to share a little bit more bonus content. I want to try to sort of space everything out and check in with the questions on here. But I want to make sure that we go through some of these extra pieces today. So Akeisha says, me and my DA boyfriend find it difficult to discuss problems, especially to do with our relationship. Okay, I'm going to put this right in the context of guilt and shame. I have insecurities around cheating and being lied to that seem to get amplified with the DA-FA dynamic. Okay, good. So number one, it's good that you've identified that, Akeisha. Good job. And I'm sorry you feel like that because it's not fun. It's not a good way to feel. And I'm going to say a couple things. So I'll keep reading this. When I bring up insecurities, his guilt makes him shut down and it feels like an attack on him. It might be more like shame. He might feel like you're shaming him or saying that there's something wrong with him or misunderstanding him, which will make him feel ashamed further, these sorts of things. It can be guilt too, but it sounds like more of a shame thing. It feels like a stalemate and we can't move forward until we learn how to discuss issues without triggering. His question is, how can he identify he's feeling guilt and shame as it's happening so that he can stop it and reassess? My question is, how can I make him feel safe to talk about our issues? That's a great question, number one. And number two, it's amazing that you guys are having that conversation, even with the difficulty of it, and bringing it here. That's like the essence of moving towards a secure attachment dynamic, because you're having the tough conversations, you're reaching out, you're sharing, you're both being vulnerable. This is great. So I just want to acknowledge you for that. So number one, okay, when he is trying to identify guilt and shame, you always, when we're familiarizing ourselves, we're getting like, we're sort of new to actually feeling our feelings, and especially dismissive avoidance, because we know that they tend to be, as a general rule, as a general pattern, they tend to be the most dissociated from their own feelings, right? So we know this. So we want to be able to familiarize ourselves with these things ahead of time. So he wants to do like a little bit of feeling work, and it can be really simple. It can just be, what are you starting to feel when you start shutting down? What does shame feel like? How does it tend to come on? He has to do some emotional exploring, essentially. So how does it tend to come on? What starts to happen inside of your body? Do you start to tense up? Do you start to feel anger on top of it because you feel angry that somebody's seeing your shame and you have a fight response? Do you have a flight response? Do you feel the need to flee or hide or walk away, leave the room, leave the space? Or do you freeze? Do you just feel paralyzed with shame and wanting to hide? And so he has to familiarize himself with what happens inside of him. So when he starts to recognize those things taking place, he knows that they're happening in real time. And number two, he has to be able to identify what he needs in those situations, okay, so that he can express them to you so that you can then make him feel safe. And what I would recommend is that you use the conflict resolution framework. So I'm not sure if you had a chance to go through that course yet, but if you haven't, the big sort of piece here for the conflict resolution framework is, when situation X happens, I feel X. And I interpret it in my reality as X, and it makes me feel X. Okay. So when we're out, I'm just going to give you an example based on your context. When we're out and you're really friendly with other women, I interpret it in my reality as me being unimportant and me being not good enough. And as a result, I start feeling really afraid and frustrated and suspicious. And so, okay, do you see that so far, right? So when the situation happens, I interpret as, and the important thing about saying I interpret it as is you're saying this isn't yours. I'm not blaming you. I'm not shaming you. I'm not guilting you. This is in my reality. This is my experience. And you're also giving the person an opportunity to see what you're feeling and experiencing. So they have an opportunity to be a little more careful about their behavior and change things, but without it being something where they have to, completely transform everything for you, but they have an opportunity to meet the need if it feels like a safe and healthy compromise to them. So you're opening doors for an exchange instead of trying to force either party into doing anything. And that's where we see the best results, is when there's an openness, a vulnerability, a happy exchange. And so then you say, I interpret it this way and I feel this way. And you follow that up by saying, and this is what would really work for me instead. And it might be something simple. It might be, maybe you want to work on being okay with him being friendly with other women, but maybe as part of that, you would love for him to be validating and reassuring as you're out together. Give you compliments or say, hey, I'm thinking about you, or, whatever it is. And so find where those insecurities are and find this like healthy exchange. And what you can do and how you're making him feel safe, to answer your question, is communicating in a way that's coming from your reality and your interpretation. And that will take that guilt and shame away from both. And then what he can do too is one other little thing is if he notices himself, and this is for everybody, if he notices himself shutting down when he feels shame, when he familiarizes himself and he can catch himself in real time, a question that you want to ask him is, when this is happening, what do you need in that moment to be able to be present in the conversation or to come back? Do you need 5 minutes of space or a break? Do you need a moment to process and to come out of that sort of shame state? Do you need us to acknowledge that you're feeling that way and let you know that you're safe and okay? So ask him what he needs so he can act on that need when it's happening. He catches it in real time, like in chronological order, catches it in real time, acts on the need. You've hopefully had a discussion with him in a way that isn't likely to trigger him anyways. And if he feels shame anyways, it's going to be a lot less when you use the framework that we just discussed. And so now you have these points where he knows his feelings. He can get out of that state because he's clear about it. He knows what he needs ahead of time and can express it in real time because he's prepared. You're less likely to trigger him. You can still have a vulnerable and comfortable conversation, and both of you can get your needs met because they're expressed in that conversation dynamic. So now you've sort of addressed all of those points from all of those different angles. So great question, and thank you for asking that, and I hope that was helpful. Hi, Efrat. Good to see you here. Okay, so I'm like, I need to catch my breath. I just talked a lot. So, I misspoke using online forum. I'm usually on the Facebook page. Yeah, so the questions, Tony, are inside the members lounge when you click on the forum, and then you click on either forum or I think the other tab says Q&A. Both of them have a series of questions. So in there. Okay. Amy, thinking about guilt and shame, I feel like I only really feel guilt in regards to being in a relationship. Why would this be? Like, oh, should I have done this or that? But not regarding other things. This would be because probably somewhere, great question, Amy, probably somewhere along the line, the rules you were taught directly or indirectly, either, through what was told to you about relationships and the messaging you were given about how maybe women should be in a relationship, etc., what your mom taught you, society, whatever it might be, a combination of all of it, or indirectly through the patterns you observed and the programs you retrieved from observing, or you absorbed from observing the patterns you saw in your own childhood. It can be that some of those rules you were taught to play by, again, directly or indirectly, were codependent. And so what I hear, and this is a beautiful example, so thank you for sharing this, you're like, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, always second guessing your behavior. It sounds like you're sort of trying to control other people's feelings or make sure that everybody's okay, or trying to hold yourself to a standard of perfectionism. And the reality is, for all of us, is that none of us are going to be perfect in relationships. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say the wrong things sometimes without meaning to. We're going to commit to things that we realize later we couldn't. We are going to have things that change. We're going to have new occurrences that happen. And all we can do is show up and be our honest selves and our best selves and be vulnerable and share as these things are taking place. And so when you're thinking, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, it sounds to me like you're managing other people's feelings or managing other people's perspectives of you. And that's really important to notice if it's either one, and you want to practice setting an intentional boundary there. And it'll feel scary at first. It'll feel like, no, I need to be able to know that I should have done that. But you want to practice being able to say, okay, if that was a mistake, and if I did hurt this person, in fact, then they have the capacity to speak up and come to me and let me know. Or if it's something that I feel like is I really made a mistake and I know better, I can always go back and have a conversation about it. But to just second guess your behavior and put all of the burden in your hands is always going to produce, it's that programming itself that creates chronic patterns of guilt. Does that make sense? It's the taking so much responsibility, holding yourself to the state of perfectionism. It's all those things underneath that are producing those patterns of chronic guilt. And there's almost nothing more. I don't know if you guys have read the book by Dr. Gabor Mate called When the Body Says No. It's basically this book of case studies about people who are sick with chronic illness. And basically, like, every single person in there struggles with chronic guilt, doesn't speak up, holds themselves to crazy standards in relationships, blames themselves for lots of things. And so we really want to be able to correct those patterns. And at first, remember, when we adopted these patterns, these were things that kept us safe. Maybe you grew up in a home where that's what everybody does, and that's what you learn. That's how to relate. Those are the rules you got. Maybe you grew up in a home where you had to manage other people's feelings or perceptions of you because they were scary. Maybe mom was super critical and would go off or get really angry. And so you had to walk on eggshells and manage her feelings. Maybe mom or dad were an alcoholic or struggled with some kind of substance abuse. Maybe one of them was really depressed and you saw it. And so you learn to manage people's feelings to try to stay safe. And so now when you break this pattern and you set these boundaries and you find where you're doing this and you say, I am not responsible. This is theirs. They can come to me if they need something and I will happily support, but I'm not going to try to do everything for somebody else or manage everybody's perspectives of me or try to be perfect all the time. Whatever boundaries you set through repetition plus emotional responses, right? It won't feel good at first. It will almost always feel like a scary thing because at one point you doing that kept you safe, and it's your conscious mind repatterning or reprogramming your own subconscious mind to let you know, hey, this was safe once, and now this was a strength, and now it's a weakness, and it's time to create change. And so, great question, and just those are some things to notice. Okay. Thank you, Kelly and Rosa for helping out and explaining. Let's see. I'm glad Tony asked. Nice, Ember. Jermaine says, yeah, great question. So Jermaine says, Thais, could you explain the distinction between compromise and sacrifice? Yes. Okay. So when we make a compromise, it starts out in a real compromise, like in its healthiest form, is two individuals truly, unauthentically, and authentically first communicating their needs. Okay. So if you're like, oh, a compromise, and you think of a compromise, and let's say it's a compromise between a dismissive avoidant and an anxiously attached individual. Okay. And let's say the anxious attachment wants to spend 5 days a week together and spend that much time together. And let's say the dismissive avoidant's like, whew, I've got a lot on my plate right now. I'm afraid of being swallowed whole by a relationship. I want to spend 1 night a week, maybe 2. But let's say that the anxious, they go to have a conversation about this. They say, you know what? Let's have a healthy conversation. Let's, talk about our needs and then make a compromise. Let's say the anxious then goes like this. Oh, I think they're going to say they want to spend like 1 night a week or maybe 2. So maybe I should say like 4 or 3 so I don't scare them away. And then the anxious comes to the dismissive and says, yeah, I was thinking, 3, maybe 4 nights a week. And then they make a compromise and the guy goes, let's say it's a male, female, the male is dismissive. Let's say he goes, oh, okay, so I was thinking like 1 or 2. So if you're okay with 3, then, 2's perfect. And it's right in the middle. And then here goes the anxious, and their problem never got resolved, right? So number one, compromise requires both people clearly and truthfully owning their own needs first and having that conversation, having the courage and the bravery to truly put their needs on the table, okay? You can question. You can say, are some of these needs based on fear? Would I be okay? Making a bit of a shift in this, things like that. Like maybe if your need is to move in together and it's been 3 months of dating and you're like, that's what I really need. You might question that, is that appropriate? Is this based on fear? Could this be based on enmeshment patterns? But you have to get in touch and consider yourself first. Okay. Like, I don't mean put yourself first, put yourself equally, but I mean, consider your truth first, like really sit with it, think about it, feel about it, consider, so and you go in with authenticity on the table. Number 2, sacrifice is knowing that you have a boundary around something and doing it anyways. And you'll feel when it's sacrificed. You'll feel that you're setting the tone for resentment, for frustration, for negativity, you'll feel like it's taking something from you instead of being something that, there's this happy exchange, and it almost gives you energy back to do this. So let's say, for example, that you have, let's say you have $50,000 of savings, and somebody comes to you and says, hey, I really need to borrow $150. You might be like, okay, you know what? Even in this space, okay, you might say, you know what? I really believe in equal exchange. I would love to help you out. And in exchange, if you don't think you can pay me back at some point, and you just need to take $150, maybe you can help me out, like moving some furniture around my house for an hour or something like that. So you find like this fair space where you're doing something. It's really not a whole bunch of sweat off your back. And, you find a nice energy exchange. So there's a conversation, a communication, and it's healthy. Let's say instead you have $1,000 in your bank account and you're trying to save for something, and somebody says, hey, I need to borrow $150. And you feel like there's pressure, and you fear saying no. You fear that they'll think that you're mean or not helpful or whatever. And so you say yes, and they might not pay you back. You don't make any effort to create an equal exchange, or at least some kind of exchange. It doesn't have to be exactly equal, but something that's like, hey, help me out with this, or, you can always help me out later, or something like that. If you're just giving the money, you don't make any effort to think of that for yourself. Sometimes you can think of it and go, you know what, I don't really need to do that. But you have to consider yourself in the process. Otherwise, you made a decision just for that person, and you left yourself out to dry. And you wouldn't do that for a child, and you wouldn't do that for somebody you love. So why do you do it for yourself, right? Or to yourself. So it's considering yourself, seeing what fits right for you, see what doesn't violate a boundary. And if something feels like it's a sacrifice, you can try to find some kind of exchange that takes place. And if you are like, no, I need the $1,000, and you give anyways, you just made this big sacrifice. And sacrifices hurt. Compromises don't. Compromises almost feel good and energizing. So really, those are the key underlying pieces. It's a great question. And I would say, like, at the forefront there, it's being able to consider yourself in the process. And so many of us that struggle with chronic guilt and shame do not have that going on. Okay? Do not consider ourselves. We consider other people in a hypervigilant manner, and we forget about ourselves in the mix. And it's a practice. It's a practice of checking in. People ask you for things, and some of us, your automatic responses, I see the most fearful and anxious. The automatic response is yes. And it's like, wait. Hold on, pause, sit with yourself. What's correct? There's no urgency to say yes to everything or to not say no. And so it's a really important thing to practice. Okay. So, okay. So let me read this. This sounds like a really interesting one. Thanks, Kelly, about the analogy. So Efrat says, about the cut example, I was raised by an amazing giving mother who would not accept our help unless we first cut. Wouldn't accept our help unless we first cut. Its programming is so strong, I minimized cutting with others, but the guilt is a sadness nurturing. That's not a cognitive process. How to approach that in a non-cognitive way. Okay, so I think what I understand, I want to make sure I have this correct. So I think what I understand is you're basically saying that your mother conditioned you to have to empathize with her and show that you were feeling her feelings in order to even accept or receive help. And so you were basically conditioned to really feel a lot of guilt by your mother. Okay, so what you said is exactly right. It's not going to feel like a cognitive process. It's going to feel like an automatic process, because when we have a deeply conditioned belief, it's not, sometimes we can remember when we have like the BTEA equation, right? I say equation, but it's not really an equation. When we have like our beliefs to thoughts to emotions are made up of neurochemical reactions, and neuroscience has proven all decisions we make are based on emotions. So when we have this like sort of line of that represents things, thoughts produce emotions, but also automatically beliefs, deeply conditioned associations can produce automatic emotional responses. So you could have an experience where, let's say, for example, your mother needs help, and you saying no, you don't even have to think thoughts. It just automatically feels bad. And it's just when a belief has been deeply ingrained. So B can skip the T and go directly to the E, if that makes sense. Okay. So in these cases, right, what do? Well, we have to recondition that belief, and we do it through exposure response. And it's kind of like what I was saying, where we have to be able to feel the guilt. We have to feel the shame, feel the fear, and be able to do it anyways. But one thing we can do is we can explain ourselves a little bit. It takes some of the pressure off, okay? So you might say to somebody, let's say your mother, Efrat, let's say let's say you're dating somebody new. And your mother's like, and this person asks you to go on a date on Friday. And your mother's like, I'm feeling lonely and I want company on Friday, but you've already committed to a date. And let's say, oh my gosh, and maybe your mom's going through a tough time and she starts guilting you. And you're like, okay, but I committed to this date first and I really want to go on the date and that's my truth. And you ask her, can I come Saturday? And she's like, nope, you don't care about me unless you come Friday or something. This might be sort of an extreme example, but let's say this is the case, okay? Well, you want to be able to say, hey, you know what? For me, I have plans ahead of time. They're very important. I feel like I'm violating my own boundary if I don't follow through with these plans. I'm sorry. I hear that you're in pain. I hear that you need company, but I also think that you can fend for yourself. I also believe in you. I think that you can show up for yourself here. I'm happy to come Sunday. You check in with your time boundary, okay? If mom's really toxic and criticizing you all the time and bringing you down and doesn't respect your boundaries, you might have a time boundary that says, okay, I can be around her for, an hour and a half before I start to feel like it's sacrificial. And so I'm going to go for an hour and a half. Maybe I'll